Winter on the Gulf of Corinth. A wealthy Greek city goes to sleep, and the next morning, it's not ruined. It's not abandoned. It's missing. Ancient writers said Helike, Poseidon's own city, was wiped out in a single night by an earthquake and a violent sea surge. Then its remains sat underwater long enough for tourists to boat over the ruins, and after that, even the underwater ruins vanished from memory. Here's the twist. For centuries, people searched the seabed, convinced this was the real Atlantis disaster. But the lost city wasn't waiting under the waves. It was buried under dry land, under orchards, fields, and roads, sealed inside the mud of an ancient lagoon like a time capsule. And today we're going to reconstruct the night Helike disappeared, and the scientific hunt that proved the story wasn't just myth, because Helike doesn't just feel like Atlantis. It may be the real-world disaster that taught Greece how to imagine Atlantis in the first place. Helike wasn't a backwater. Ancient and modern research describes it as a major city in Achaea, associated with the Achaean Dodecapolis, and famous enough that writers kept repeating its story for centuries. But what really made Helike powerful wasn't only trade, it was religion. This was the seat of worship for Poseidon Helikonios. Poseidon not just as sea god, but as the earth shaker. This distinction is crucial. In the Greek world, Poseidon wasn't just about tridents and waves. He was the force responsible for the ground instability that plagued the region. The people of Helike didn't just worship him. They minted coins with his face on the obverse and a trident on the reverse, signaling to the entire Mediterranean that they were under his specific protection. They were the leaders of the Achaean League, a confederation of 12 cities. They had colonies as far away as Priene in Asia Minor and the fabulously wealthy Sybaris in Italy. This was a civilization with reach. But in the ancient mind, great power often invited great disaster. Disasters weren't random. They were messages. Later traditions pinned Helike's doom on hubris, a moral crime connected to Poseidon's sanctuary. The story goes that Ionian delegates came to the city to ask for sacred objects or permission to build a replica of the temple. The Helikeans refused, and in some versions even murdered the supplicants. Whether that story is literal or not, it's exactly the kind of warning label ancient cultures attached to places where nature could kill you fast. So keep that in mind, because we're going to watch the moral story collide with the geology, and the geology wins. Helike sat on one of Europe's nastiest tectonic neighborhoods, the Corinth Rift. This is an actively stretching crustal zone. To understand why this is so dangerous, imagine the Earth being pulled apart like taffy. Modern measurements put the extension rate in the several to over 10 millimeters per year range, depending on where you measure it. In tectonic terms, that is sprinting. And Helike wasn't perched on solid bedrock. It was built across a delta plain, sediment laid down by rivers over time. That kind of ground can behave like a trap. The city sat between two rivers, the Selinus and the Carinites, on land that was essentially layers of sand, silt, and clay. It was fertile, beautiful, and deadly. Because when strong shaking hits water-saturated sand and silt, the grains can lose contact and the soil can temporarily behave like a fluid. This is liquefaction. It's a phenomenon we saw in modern times during the Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand or the 1964 Niigata earthquake in Japan. Solid ground turns into soup. Heavy structures like temples or fortification walls don't just fall over. They sink. They tilt. They slide into the earth as the foundation literally dissolves beneath them. And we know this region does exactly that, because later earthquakes here produced classic field evidence. Fissures, sand blows, coastal changes, real, the ground turned wrong, behavior observed and mapped. So the setting is perfect for an ancient nightmare, a coastal city built on wet sediment in a rift that does not stop moving. Now comes the detail everyone remembers. A later Roman-era writer reports that days before Helike vanished, animals and vermin, mice, snakes, and more, left the city in a mass exodus. Ancient people saw it and didn't know what it meant. This story has fascinated scientists for decades. Is it possible? Some theories suggest that animals are sensitive to pre-seismic electromagnetic emissions, positive airborne ions released by rocks under extreme stress days before they fracture. Others suggest they sense P waves that are too subtle for humans. While we can't treat ancient reports as controlled data, the persistence of the story is telling. It wasn't just a sudden shock. The Earth was screaming before it snapped. So let's treat this for what it is, an ancient ghost story. A detail they remembered because it fit the horror of what came next. Because whatever the animals did, the geology didn't need omens. It only needed one night. The destruction is traditionally dated to the winter of 373 BC. Ancient sources describe an earthquake and a catastrophic sea incursion. Modern reconstructions vary on the exact sequence and scale, but many agree on the key ingredients: strong earthquake shaking, soft sediment failure or liquefaction, and rapid flooding that turned parts of the coastal plain into a lagoon. Imagine the chaos. It wasn't just the shaking. The ground likely dropped vertically. Geologists call this coastal subsidence. One moment the streets are above sea level. The next, the land drops 1 or 2 meters and the sea rushes in to fill the void. Some models estimate a mid-6 magnitude range event for the earthquake that leveled the city, with later ground failure helping submerge areas. Think sliding, slumping, and landscape reshaping. Not a clean city fell straight down. And about the wave, ancient writers do describe a seismic sea wave, but researchers disagree about how large it was and what the deposits prove. Some argue for a massive tsunami generated by a submarine landslide in the Gulf. Others emphasize that the subsidence itself, the land sinking, was enough to flood the city without a Hollywood-style megawave. Whether it was a wall of water or a rising tide of mud, the result was the same. So the most accurate way to say it is this: Helike was hit by an earthquake that wrecked the city, destabilized the delta ground, and transformed the coastline into a flooded, lagoon-like environment. Enough that later visitors could report ruins visible in the sea, at least for a time. And that's why Helike became famous. It wasn't just destruction, it was erasure. If you like archaeology when it's treated like a real investigation, texts on one side, geology on the other, tap-like, it helps this kind of deep history actually reach people. Now, how do you find a city that vanished twice? Once in mud, then again in memory? A few years after Helike's disaster, Plato writes Atlantis, a powerful society, favored by Poseidon, destroyed by earthquakes and floods in a single day and night. Is Helike definitely the model? We can't prove Plato copied Helike. But the timing and the disaster mechanics make Helike one of the strongest real-world candidates for the kind of event that could fuel an Atlantis-scale story in Greek imagination. Plato wrote his dialogues Timaeus and Critias roughly 13 years after the destruction of Helike. It would have been the biggest news story of his lifetime. A major naval power destroyed by the gods for its arrogance, sinking into the water. The parallels are almost too perfect. Even if Helike isn't Atlantis, it shows something important. Myths don't always begin as fantasy. Sometimes they begin as trauma, preserved as narrative. For a long time, the search for Helike focused offshore because ancient writers described submergence, and there were serious investigations. In the 1960s, the famous Greek archaeologist Spyridon Marinatos, the man who found Akrotiri on Santorini, searched the Gulf. In 1976, Jacques Cousteau brought his famous ship, the Calypso, to scan the seafloor. They used sonar surveys. They used sub-bottom profilers. They found targets that looked promising, but every time they sent divers down, it turned out to be geological noise, not walls. The turning point came with a simple, brutal idea. What if the coastline moved? In deltas, rivers don't politely deposit a little sand and stop. They bury landscapes. Over 2,300 years, the sediments from the mountains wash down, pushing the coastline outward. And in the Gulf of Corinth, you're also dealing with uplift and subsidence. tectonics literally reshaping the shoreline over centuries. So the Helike project, founded by Dora Katsonopoulou and Steven Soter, changed the strategy. Their approach became, stop hunting only under the sea, start hunting under the land. Use boreholes, geophysics, and excavation to find occupation horizons, layers where humans lived, now trapped beneath meters of younger sediment. This wasn't easy work. They had to drill dozens of boreholes across the plain, blindly probing for a layer of destruction. They used electrical resistivity tomography, shooting electricity into the ground to measure resistance. Stone walls resist electricity differently than wet mud, and when cores started coming up with ceramics and structural traces, sometimes many meters down, the story changed from lost forever to buried. Here's the moment that feels like a thriller scene in real life. A core sample comes up. Not clean sand, but dark, organic, lagoon-like mud, the signature of a drowned environment. Embedded in and around these buried layers, cultural material, walls, ceramics, evidence the sea had become land again, and the city was sleeping beneath it. Excavations in the Helike plain didn't just locate one city phase. They revealed a stacked history. They found the classical destruction layer, cobblestones scattered by waves, roof tiles smashed by the collapse, and marine microfossils proving the ocean had been there. But they found more. They found evidence of later reoccupation. A substantial Hellenistic phase, including evidence for a textile dye works industry in the area. This suggests that even after the catastrophe, the economic value of the site was too high to abandon. They even found a major Roman road crossing the plain, suggesting later travelers moved right over the buried landscape, perhaps unaware that a lost metropolis lay just a few meters beneath their chariot wheels. And then came the bigger revelation. Helike wasn't only a classical tragedy. Underneath, archaeologists found an early Bronze Age proto-urban settlement. We are talking about structures from 2400 BC, long buildings known as corridor houses, which are some of the earliest examples of complex architecture in mainland Greece. This showed that this landscape had been lived on, damaged, and relived on for millennia. Same region, same hazards, same human choice. Come back anyway. Ancient writers love absolutes. The entire population perished, the city vanished, the land became sea. But archaeology tends to argue with absolutes. Researchers working in the Helike region point out evidence that while the earthquake and flooding wrecked Helike, the idea of permanent total annihilation is likely exaggerated, and that the region saw significant resettlement in later classical Hellenistic times. That doesn't make the story less dramatic. It makes it more human. A city can be gone in cultural memory, even if people survive, because its center of power, its sacred heart, its street grid, its shoreline, can be ripped out and replaced by mud and water. Helike didn't just suffer a disaster, it suffered a landscape reboot. Helike is a warning carved into geography. Build on a delta, and the ground can betray you. Live in an active rift, and the coastline itself can relocate. And when you tell the story afterward, you'll probably turn physics into morality, because morality is how humans try to make disaster feel controllable. But Helike also carries a second lesson, one we don't talk about enough. Resilience isn't pretty. People returned, settlements shifted, building styles changed, industries reappeared, roads crossed the plain. Life kept pushing back into the hazard zone because the location was valuable, and humans are consistent that way. So if you ever wondered how a real place becomes a legend like Atlantis, this is how. A real city, a real catastrophe, a coastline that refuses to stay put, and a story that gets sharper and more moral with every retelling. So what do you think? Was Helike the disaster that echoed into Plato's Atlantis? Fuel for a story about power, corruption, and sudden erasure? Or do you think Atlantis draws from multiple real catastrophes stitched together into one perfect myth? Drop your theory in the comments. If you want more Lost City investigations like this, Subscribe for weekly deep dives. This is Ancient Chronicles HD, and if you want another truth behind the legend, click the next video on your screen right now.